Hey guys, in this video I'll show how I make 4 trees, covering how I usually make my own tree trunks and how I prepare a canopy. I'll start with the more fantastic or old looking tree I usually make. For this I twist some armature wire as thick as possible. Each fold of twisted wire means one extra arm of the tree in the final result. I usually bend enough to make 4 to 6 arms. For this, you'll obviously need a corded or cordless drill, or you can manually do this, although I'd assume it would take a very long time to do so. Once we are done with the twisting, it's time to open it up to give the rough shape of the tree. Since I cover the trunk with clay, it's necessary to wrap it up with foil so the clay would have more surface to hold on to. I use air drying clay as it's cheaper and doesn't take me to bake it, which is an extra workload in my already busy schedule. When covering the trunk with the clay, it's important to have a good coverage. You wouldn't want the foil shoving underneath or in between each clay piece you stick there. Also, it's a good idea to give the rough barky detail at this point if you don't have a Dremel sanding and carving option. Once it dried, if you do have the Dremel option, it's best to sand away the excess sections or the portions you overcovered with the clay. If you don't have the Dremel option, you can carefully sand off the excess with a low-grade sanding paper or sanding stick, and make sure to sand with higher grade ones for finer details or a smoother finish. Now, the problem with the air drying clay, since the armature wire is not that solid, the clay tends to crack. In order to counter this problem, I find applying CA glue and then baking soda all over the surface to be a sound solution. It both gives sturdiness to the trunk and baking soda adds a nice gritty texture all over it. Again, if you have the Dremel option, you can create bark details with a carving bit. The deep crevices, holes and such result very good after the paint job, especially with adding shadows and highlights. But if you don't, the gritty texture from applied baking soda still provides a nice texture for painting. That's why it's important to give bark details before the clay dries if you don't have a Dremel. For this demonstration, I intentionally carved one side with bark details and one side I didn't, so we can see the difference after the paint job. If I want a tree that looks straight up, I use a regular straight branch or a thick skewer. I usually collect branches and stuff while I'm walking outside. They, by default, have the shapes, curves, lines or crevices I would work on to replicate anyway. As my second tree, I went for a branch that has knots, vertical lines, etc. I shave off the tip of it so it looks natural and strip off the dead bark so it wouldn't get in the way during the painting. Then you would need to drill some holes for the branch sticks to be glued into, either with a pinwise or Dremel bits or cordless drill, whatever option you have. It's a good idea to sand it a bit in order to both clean off the fibers and get a clean result from the shaved off part of it. Then using skewers or toothpicks I create branches. I intentionally bent these to have a more organic look. You would naturally start from the bottom using longer sticks, work your way up using shorter sticks. You can and maybe should add individual branches, especially to the bottom layers, as they will need to hold and carry the canopy we'll add later. You can also do the same with armature wire, as many people do, but I find it harder to work with since I find it harder to glue the wire to the main body of the tree, as well as wire is harder to paint than toothpicks and skewers. Also, you can make the exact same tree and turn it into a variation of a pine tree using static grass with an applicator. I just don't have a good static grass applicator and don't have much options in regards to grass length. So I kinda skip making pine trees, and there are a million guides on YouTube making them if you ever need it. Another method of making a tree trunk is to glue different branch pieces, skewers and sticks together. When I need an asymmetrical looking tree, I go for this method. All you need is just baking soda and CA glue apart from the obvious sticks and bits. Downside is that it gets very messy with baking soda all over the working area and CA glue gunk on your fingers, but gives the creative freedom of the shape and angles for each arm or cluster of branches. It also is kind of fun, you're actually building a tree from scratch. And as the last option, you can use a suitable dried branch if its shape resembles a miniature tree. I picked this up from the sidewalk and initially planned to clip off the edges, use them as branches, but saved it for this video. In order to paint your trunks, you can go for almost any color of paint. I usually either prime them in plain black or very dark brown. As I mentioned in a previous video from some months back, I usually slack with trunk painting and directly go for a brownish palette. But as we all know, there are so many color options for how tree bark and bodies look in the nature. From a technical standpoint, the most important part of the paint job, in my opinion, is the dry brushing and the final layer of filter or washing. All the details you worked before, or was there on the actual branch piece you used, will come up at this point. I usually don't pay much attention to the paint up until the dry brushing point. To make a tree canopy, I use polyester. You can get these stuff out of cheap pillows. I get mine from a sofa upholstery. They give away their scraps. I stretch these as much as possible without ripping them. They usually have 2 layers and with enough care, it's easy to open them up. After I'm done with them, I mix a dark green paint. With some paint in my palms, I roll them around gently, making sure they get evenly covered with the paint. A tip here, don't just soak these in paint. Even though they don't soak up the liquids just as cotton or fabrics do, they tend to get clogged up and very stiff once dried if covered with way too much of paint. You would get the drift of it after a try or two. Once done, it takes about an entire day or a bit more for them to be fully dried. These clogged up ones you don't want to use. It's too stiff to work with. This is just trash. Instead, choose these softer ones. Before I use these on the trees, I stretch them a bit more. Then covering them on the tree bodies is just up to your imagination. I glue these to the branches with the help of CA glue. Regular PVA glue never worked for me as I have to roll these around curvy branches and such, and PVA glue takes forever to dry. But with CA glue, it's usually a messy ordeal. My fingers or the tip of the tweezers get glued and stuck sometimes in the process. For flocking, I use my own homemade ones. If you want to know how I make it, you can refer to the previous tutorial. I use multiple coats of hairspray to stick the flock on the canopy. Never used it, but I hear it's a better option to use adhesive sprays for this. I still prefer to use hairsprays because they're a far cheaper option for me. I apply 1 coat of hairspray, then apply the flock over it, and then apply a second heavy coat of hairspray to make sure flock doesn't go anywhere. And do the same for various number of times for different tones and colors of flocks. Make sure to shake off the excess so it won't cause a mess in your work area later on. And as a final tip, since the leftover flock has some residue of hairspray over them, they tend to clump. Then they end up being nice to use as foliage. So make sure to save them in a jar or a container for future use. The easiest one out of all these was this. Simple, easy to make. It would take like 15 minutes tops to make one. No paint, no gluing needed. This one ended up nicely as well. Natural barky details are showing up thanks to dry brushing with lighter colors. To be honest with this one, I'm not sure how I feel about it. Maybe another big branch on the opposing side would make it look better and bulkier, and probably would have used extra baking soda to make the top part thicker. It looks like bent plastic, but it is what it is. And finally, the fantasy-like tree. You can see the difference between the part details carved with Dremel and the side without. It kinda looks like a colorful broccoli, don't you think? Anyway guys, I hope this was a useful tutorial. See you all in the next one.